Welcome back. And now that you've had a very quick intro to Roman history in general, we're now going to discuss in detail our first major Roman period of history, and that is the King period. This is the one that is pertinent to the second work of literature that you have read now, and that's Livy, the book one of his major history of Rome. And so now we're going to provide some of the historical background in order to give you the appropriate context for what Livy is describing historically and mythologically in that first book, relating this early history of Rome before he gets into his main topic of the Republican history of Rome. The first thing I'd like you to do is pause your video, please, and go to Sakai Resources. The family tree of these 7 kings, plus some other characters associated with them, is provided in a document called Dramatis Personae of Livy. So please pause your video, go to Sakai Resources, and locate the document called Dramatis Personae of Livy. Again, the document and resources, Dramatis Personae of Livy. And please pause the video. Okay, do you have that document open? Excellent. Okay, so as you can see on the document, it organizes the characters provided for you in Livy's history by the arrangement of the 7 kings. So you can see, of course, the names of the kings themselves, and then underneath each of those, by outline, other characters, either family members or friends or anybody else associated with them specifically. So that's just meant as a guideline, so you can put the names together as you go through Livy's first book. Now, I'm not going to go through in extensive detail here about the 7 kings, because a lot of it is there in Livy for you to read, but I will touch upon some important highlights to help you put them in context. I certainly want to say some things about Romulus, and our really good first king, as well as Tarquinius Superbus, our not so great last king, in order to provide some bookends here for the king period. Also, I want to touch upon some historical background that we should understand about this king period to understand why there is indeed some intermingling of history and mythology here in Livy's description of this. So, okay, the first thing to cover in general is that the dates for this king period are supposed to be 753 BC to 510 BC. 753 BC is the canonical date for the foundation of Rome. 510 BC is the canonical expulsion of the final king Tarquinius Superbus that leads to the introduction of the Roman Republic the following year, 509 BC, with the 2 consuls. Now, that means that we're supposed to believe that we have 7 kings who rule successfully over an approximately 240-year period. So my first question to you is, do you buy it? I would hope not. Scholars do not, and in fact, it's very unlikely to be true. For several reasons. First of all, it does not make a lot of sense that 7 kings, especially this violent final one, could have ruled peacefully for 240 years. That means approximately 30-40 years on average per reign without interruption. It's very unlikely that historically that could have occurred. Besides that, we have independent evidence to suggest that there were other kings, and that maybe this king period wasn't necessarily precisely these 240 or so years. It could be that Titus Tatius, the king of the Sabines, might have been king of the Romans at one point. Also, Lars Porsena is another 8th name of somebody who might have been king of Rome, and that is obviously not included in here. So it's rather unlikely that we had precisely 7 kings in this neat paradigm of precisely 30-40 years per king, lasting out this whole 240 years. It does not make any sense. That's the first problem. The second problem actually has to do with the date 753 BC itself, and that is because that date is based on the calculations of the later scholar Varro, who wrote voluminously and very eruditely about Roman history and Roman antiquity. And unfortunately, we have lost most of his works, but we do have enough of them surviving to get a pretty good idea of what he studied and theorized about Roman history. His calculation of the foundation of the city of Rome came out to 753 BC, which is all well and good, except there is no supporting evidence for it independent of his word. And in fact, the archaeological remains for Rome suggest that the villages that came together to form Rome well predate 753 BC, And as even Livy admits, many of the institutions that formed the Roman Republic definitely come quite a bit later than 753 BC. So the idea of the creation of the city of Rome in one go, all in the year 753 BC, is definitely completely implausible. As they say, Rome was not built in a day. It wasn't really any truer for the Romans themselves than it would be now. So that's the second difficulty. And the third problem is the other date, 510 BC. That could actually be a reasonably okay date for the beginning of the Republic, because we do have lists of the consuls who served year after year after year for the Roman Republic because they were elected annually. And we are fortunate to have a list called the Fasti, F-A-S-T-I, that does provide us with the list of consuls. So that is good. And it does, as it turns out, go back to the 400s BC. So it could very well be that the beginning of the Republic might very well have been around 510 BC. But it is still a suspicious date because it happens to coincide in Greek history with the date that Athens expelled a tyrant that had been ruling despotically for 4 years. That was Hippias, who was the son of his father, a much more renowned tyrant named Pisistratus. Hippias was expelled after he had committed Athens to a reign of terror for 4 years. He went out in like 511 to 510 BC in that period, and then 508 BC is the foundation of Athenian democracy under Cleisthenes. The odd coincidence of this major governmental change in Rome with that equally major governmental change in Athens seems a little suspicious. The possibility that there might have been some effort at historical alignment, possibly. Be that as it may, though, those are the dates that are given to us, and the history/mythology given to us about the king period gives us these 7 names, so we will take it for what it's worth. And now let's turn to the actual kings themselves. Just to run through them quickly before I get into details about the ones that count. You have Romulus himself and his brother Remus. I'm going to come back to him because we have quite a bit to say about him. We have Numa Pompilius, who comes after Romulus. Numa Pompilius is the renowned king, considered very peaceful and very successful for Rome, who instituted all of the various religious positions, including the high one of Pontifex Maximus. That name Pontifex is where we get in English the word pontiff. That's another name for the Pope in the Catholic Church. So Numa Pompilius is the successor to Romulus. We have Tullus Hostilius, the one who is the first wartime king. He attacked most of the cities nearby, around outside of the territory of Latium, and took over the city of Fidenae and also Alba Longa. And it was Tullus Hostilius also who you'll see described very dramatically and rather grotesquely in the work, quartered with 4 horses a particular king who was supposed to have supported him but did not. He failed to show up when he was supposed to, and he waited until he knew who was going to be the winning side before appearing. And Tullus appropriately rewarded him for his service by quartering him with the horses. And it's that editorial comment that Livy makes in which he says, this is the old barbaric way in which scores were settled back then. We, of course, in proper Roman days and in the late Republic and the beginning of the Empire, never carry out such barbaric practices today. So that's a bit about Tullus Hostilius. His successor is Ancus Marcius, who continues on with some of the warfare expansion, but is also considered a fairly peaceable king. And then after him, we get into a dispute between his 2 sons, who are supposed to be the next kings, and this Etruscan family, the Tarquins. So the next one who comes in is Tarquinius Priscus. He's the first of 3 Etruscan kings. And the Etruscans, remember, live in Etruria, which is the territory north of Latium along the west coast of Italy, so therefore north of later Rome. And the Etruscans themselves have a long, distinguished history that parallels that of Rome. And like the Romans, the Etruscans are also foreigners from outside. We think they came in potentially from somewhere around the Black Sea region. And the Romans themselves, of course, describe their own history as coming from Troy. So they seem to have come from similar parts of the world. and therefore have been from outside. And the Etruscans have some very nice remains left over in their cities, and appear to have been a very advanced civilization in their own right, with a great deal of literature and art that we can see. We don't have, unfortunately, any actual literary works that we can make use of, but we do have their language, and with some success, we're able to do some translation of it. So Tarquinius Superbus was the first of the Etruscan kings. Then there is Servius Tullius, who was the next and the penultimate king. Servius Tullius is the one who establishes the full census system at Rome, which defines voting rights and citizenships and property ownership all through Rome. And then finally, of course, comes this rather bad guy, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquinius the Proud, the one who thinks himself as really great, but isn't necessarily so much so. All right, so that's a run through of the seven kings just very quickly. Now let's discuss Romulus in detail here, and then I'm going to use a second video to discuss the fall of the kingship with Tarquinius Superbus. So first of all, Romulus. As is detailed for us at the beginning of Virgil's history, Livy's history, but also in Virgil's Aeneid, we know that the association between Rome and Troy comes about because of the travels of the refugee Aeneas from Troy, who makes his way across the Mediterranean in order to get over to Italy eventually, as we see detailed in the work you're going to read in detail in a little bit, Virgil's Aeneid. But now, Livy summarizes some of this history in the opening chapters of his work here before getting into the kings themselves. You may remember there was that very quick run-through of all the various kings from Aeneas down to Numitor and Amulius, the one who threw Numitor out, and then, of course, Romulus and Remus, in order to show the successorship. So Livy doesn't spend a lot of time with this, but it's important for him to show this because there is a specific family connection between Aeneas, the original founder of the territory in Latium that will eventually become Roman, and Romulus and Remus, the ones who will actually found Rome itself. Okay, so Aeneas arrives from Troy after a lot of misadventures and goes through a long war there in Latium at the mouth of the Tiber in order to finally establish the colony of Lavinium that will become where Rome will eventually be situated. After the various successors from Aeneas, Ascanius, his son, and so forth, we come to Numitor. We have a few examples here of one of my favorite tropes from ancient history, which is always be careful when two brothers are trying to share rule. It doesn't work. So we have Numitor, the good king, and we have Amulius, his evil brother, who deposes Numitor and takes over for him. Numitor has a daughter named variantly Rhea Silvia or Ilia. Ilia is an interesting name, of course, because it sounds similar to Ilium, which is the other name for Troy. Plus, of course, Ilia is rather similar to Julia and Julius, and that of course, makes the connection between Romulus and Remus and the Julian family, of whom Caesar and Augustus will be the most prominent members. So, okay, we have Rhea Silvia, who is the daughter of Numitor, who theoretically could give birth to a son who might end up becoming an avenger against Amulius. So Amulius manages to get her vested as a Vestal virgin so that she has a vow of celibacy and therefore will not be able to produce any children. Will that stop everybody? No, because Mars shows up on the scene, besmitten with love with Rhea Silvia, and he gets to her, and there are two kids born, and they would be Romulus and Remus. When Amulius finds out what's happened, that these two kids have been born, he bundles them up in a basket and tosses them into the Tiber River. That, of course, should put an end to them, but unfortunately for him, but very luckily for Roman history, he chose low tide. So the basket floated ashore, the kids survived, and they were nursed by a she-wolf, famously. That's, of course, the famous symbol that goes along with SPQR in the Roman Senate. And then thereafter, a woodpecker feeds them, sent down by Jove. And then finally, the shepherd Faustulus raises them. And that's how we get the two brothers, Romulus and Remus. Okay, so you would guess that now we're in excellent shape having Romulus and Remus now growing up to become kings. No, it's not that simple. Come back next video and we will continue the story.